Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, October 10th, 2025, and our dear friends Scott Ritter and John Helmer join us today to discuss the case of Ukraine and the escalation in Ukraine. Let me start, Scott, with you. The basic question, I think, would be in your opinion, is NATO heading towards a major escalation with Russia?
Well, we have to separate politics from reality. Um, I think the thematic of the necessity a for viewing Russia as a threat worthy of escalation is a reality in Europe today. I mean, this is being used to justify military modernization, political realignments, industrialization efforts, basically a top to bottom rebuilding of Europe is being done on the foundation of the notion that Russia is a threat worthy of this kind of political, economic, societal investment. Then there's the reality that NATO as a military institution is atrophied to the point that no amount of steroids and gym work will ever make this body recover, especially on a timeline that would be conducive to confronting Russia as it relates to the Ukrainian conflict. By the time Europe could get its act together, and I believe Europe is going to collapse long before it ever joins together. But a timeline. The Germans have spoken of 2029 as a potential date. This conflict will be long over. Russia will have achieved its objectives, and will have moved past this the current predicament that Europe has inflicted on itself.
John, your take on that?
Well, in the first place, we agree the escalation of NATO war making against Russia has been going on for a long time. That's not new. The escalation that is new is, you can see it in Poland, you can see it in France, you can see it in England, and it's in each country there are different circumstances. President Macron can attack a Russian oil cargo in a tanker offshore, called piracy by President Putin, because he's attempting now internally, as a weak president facing a hostile parliament, to rule by executive decree. So it helps in France to stimulate anti-Russian, anti-Slav race war making in order to facilitate the constitutional requirements that France faces a war threat. This is a French political problem in a weak NATO state, but the NATO alliance is composed of states like that. Whether we look at France, whether we look at the UK, whether we look at Germany, Poland, Norway, and the others. So the escalation is underway. The problem is that it's stimulated by the United States. It's part of the Trump plan to sequence wars along all of the NATO fronts. Now, we've, in the last 48 hours, seen a significant contradiction between, on the one hand, the foreign ministry of Russia, Sergei Ryabkov and Mikhail Galuzin, saying that the understanding reached between President Trump and President Putin at Anchorage has been exhausted, was Ryabkov's term, emasculated, was Galuzin's term. And both of them have added that this is primarily because of the European states' commitment to continuing the war on the Ukrainian battlefield and escalating the war along Russia's western and northern fronts. On the other hand, Yuri Ushakov, speaking for President Putin, and Putin himself in the last few hours in Dushanbe in a press conference, have insisted that this is not, the words aren't exhausted and emasculated. The words are that the understandings continued, so that the attempt on the part of the Kremlin to divide the escalation of NATO against Russia from the US and find some way of blocking NATO using Trump is in perilous condition right now, an uncertain condition.
Scott, let me start with a little bit critical question, which is the case of Russia and how, the administration is in Russia, the Putin administration is united. In your opinion, when you look at Russia today, are there factional differences in Moscow on key strategic war, trade, and alliance issues?
In Moscow, the city, the physical entity
No,
of
I'm
the
talking
city,
about Moscow. I'm talking about Russia, the policy of Russia as a whole.
in terms of policy makers, key decision
Yeah,
makers.
exactly.
Look, I think Vladimir Putin runs a strong-handed but collegial government. I think there are forums and occasions where people can raise questions and concerns. They do this out of the limelight. I don't think Vladimir Putin tolerates, once a decision has been made, to tolerate, efforts by senior officials to publicly speak out against that. So a perception can be created that there is no opposition. I would say that my feeling is that there is a time and place for people to speak out, and that is encouraged. But once the decision has been made, the duty is to fulfill the objectives. So yeah, within Moscow, I think in the official circles, there are places where people can raise their objections. Once a decision has been made, then what happens is that people who are on the periphery of decision making, or people who were formerly associated with decision making but no longer, there you get you can get some critical voices heard. But they don't have Vladimir Putin's not losing any sleep at night over any of the critical voices that are being raised in Moscow today, in my opinion, because he is the commander-in-chief. He is the chief executive, and he has a process in which policies are formulated and implemented, and the government adheres to those processes. That's my take.
Yeah. John?
I agree that there are factions. You'd have to say, and I think Scott would agree, that in many respects, Russian decision-making, both on war, tactically, operationally, and strategically, on economic policy, Russia is a more democratic decision-making polity than France or the UK or the US, for that matter. When you look at the difference between the presidency and the Congress, their factionalism can be pejorative, but in fact it's democratic. And what we have to understand about there are two things about the way we understand Russian policymaking and Putin policymaking. The first is that it is collegial, as Scott said, and that means that people disagree on a whole range of important issues, and that in a collegial atmosphere, a collective atmosphere, collective decision-making is the plan, is the policy that Putin has adopted. Before Russia sent its first delegation, led by a presidential emissary, Vladimir Medinsky, to the Istanbul talks, the President Putin called in a very large meeting of the key officials. It was an attempt to show, and in fact to listen, and in fact implement collective decision-making. Now, last week, President Putin made a number of remarks at Valdai, a club conference in Sochi, which have been misinterpreted, and he has tried to back away and clarify what he said, including the key point that he made shortly afterwards, that he would rely on his colleagues to make decisions regarding, for example, the threatened deployment of Tomahawks against Russia, and so on. Since then, there was an early meeting of the Security Council, civilian body, and then an unusual meeting of commanders of the front armies, the general staff, and the defense minister. Now, that's collegiality operating. And the second major distinction in the Russian case, in President Putin's case, but not long before him, leaving out the Yeltsin period, Russia learns from its mistakes much faster than most people and most armies. And to admit that and acknowledge that mistakes have been made, mistakes of timing, mistakes of operation, mistakes of application, mistakes of anticipation, all of those things are admitted. That's how government should work, and that's how Russia does work. The mistakes that have been made and are being made, which we can come back to in a short while, involve, in particular, how to bring the war to a conclusion that achieves Russia's objectives, secures Russia in an indivisible security arrangement, not only with its next door neighbor, but with the entire neighborhood, with Europe. There's no doubt that people have strong differences. There's no doubt that when President Putin offered President Trump last February to suspend the electric war campaign against the Ukraine, the general staff were not happy, not happy. In the last few weeks, we've seen let's say, a correction of what that factional difference amounted to. And the electric war campaign is now in full swing, maintained each day. So this isn't to say that people are opposed to the president. It's to say that they recognize mistakes of timing, of anticipation, of operations are made, and they're being corrected. And Putin has, to his credit and to the credit of the general staff, the intelligence services, and the foreign ministry, corrected and collectively what they want to do. But that leaves significant issues undecided, unresolved. One of them's Palestine and Israel.
Scott, do you feel that Donald Trump is ready or is willing to put an end to the conflict in Ukraine?
Donald Trump, you want me to, again, I don't mean to be critical, but Nima, but reading Donald Trump's like reading tea leaves 5 months after the teacup's been emptied. It's let me comment on this. First of all, again, John and I are in total agreement the way that I perceive the Russian government to function. I would say that, however, we have to acknowledge that with the Trump administration, we have a beast that's totally different than the way the Russian government was designed to operate. Back when, I was doing arms control and such, we had a State Department, we had a Department of Defense, we had various official agencies that interfaced professionally with their Soviet counterparts. And for the most part, this kind of professional relationships existed, across different administrations. This war began in its current manifestation in February 2022 under the Biden administration. And the problem with the Biden administration is they cut off relations with Russia. All of these professional contacts that would happen, where Undersecretary of, Deputy Defense, whatever, has a phone book. Back in the day, we call a Rolodex, and you could call your counterpart, and it was encouraged. You could talk and say, "Hey, problem X, Y, and Z. I've got to go, work this thing out. Help me out here. What's going on? What do we need to do to keep this from spinning out of control?" And there was this kind of dialogue that was done at the lower levels to keep problems from manifesting themselves into things that the big bosses had to deal with. Biden cut that off. There just was no talking at all. And this caused the Russians to go into a specific kind of decision-making mode. Basically, you're working in a vacuum where assumptions have to be made, et cetera. And unfortunately, when you're geared to receiving information inputs and you suddenly don't have that, you have to make decisions in an information vacuum, and mistakes are made, as John said. But the thing about the Russians is they learn from their mistakes immediately because they own up to them, and then they make corrective action, and they move forward. So Trump comes in, and Anatoly Antonov, the former Russian ambassador to the United States, when I asked him, who do you want to win? He said, I ain't touching that question with a 10-foot pole. But I will tell you this, the Russians prefer predictability. We would like predictability. We'll take that over just about anything, because even if it's bad, we can make effective policy based upon predictability, based upon known knowns. Donald Trump is anything, he's not predictable. And the one thing that happened is that he didn't staff the various agencies that Biden had shut down. So from the Russian perspective, you still have zero input coming in. But the big change was that the top levels were talking. And see, this is problematic because when top levels are talking, but you don't have backup from the intermediate and the lower levels, everything else is still dependent upon what's happening at the top. And you're not getting the normal advisory chain going up before a primary talks to a primary, a principal to a principal. It's happening in a vacuum or a very limited advisory capacity. And I think what we're seeing today in Russia is that Vladimir Putin has the task of dealing with Donald Trump in a advisory support vacuum, that there are many people who would normally be involved before presidents talk to presidents. There's so many other people that are talking, making sure that agendas are defined, et cetera. And this isn't happening. Now, this is being concentrated in a handful of people around President Putin's office. And so there's a disconnect between what Putin is trying to do with Trump, manage an unmanageable personality to the benefit of Russian policy, trying to get Trump to move along in the direction that Russia wants, understanding that Trump is being pulled in 50 different ways. And this creates a complexity, a level of complexity that I think we have to factor in when we are being critical of the Russian government. We have to acknowledge that Donald Trump is a problem set unlike any other problem set the Russians have ever dealt with. And there's no bureaucratic answer to Donald Trump. It's a problem of the Russian presidency. And oftentimes that means that the presidency is disconnected from the collegial advisors that they have. And he ends up having to back brief them as opposed to them briefing him up front. He ends up back briefing them on things. So I just, that's my perspective on the issue. And I'll be more than happy to yield the floor right now to see if John has critical commentary on this, which is okay.
Well, thanks, Scott. Look, there are unique things, speaking as an American, from an American perspective. When I was in the Carter administration, in the early months of the Carter administration, I was in the cabinet room when we briefed President Carter on how to reorganize White House decision-making and the administration that he'd been committed to during the political campaign of 76 to remove and dismantle the imperial presidency, as it was called then. And what distinguished Carter, and I'm not making a pro or a con here, was he could read. In front of him was a 300-page briefing book, which I and 15 more of my colleagues, some military officers on secondment, had composed for him on how to improve decision-making process so the president could make a decision on the basis of real choices submitted on paper from the agencies, intelligence services, military services, domestic policy making. He could see. Now, this president cannot read, does not read. He has, and this is very clear from the record, he likes pictures. He's easily manipulated. The cabinet room is not a listening room. You've seen President Trump berate, insult, and use his meeting in the cabinet room to grandstand for the press. Let's leave that aside. There is a fundamental problem on the US side. There has never been such a, as Scott said, disconnection. And for the time being, there's no national security staff. It was both purged and then eliminated because there's no national security advisor except for the Secretary of State. When Henry Kissinger ran that show, he had Alexander Haig and a bunch of other very capable people running national security council. Coordination in this administration is being done by individuals under President Trump who regard him as very predictable. I've called him the retroactive president, what the paperwork chain does. And individuals not well known in foreign policy or to the Russian side, like Stephen Miller, deputy chief of staff, who has an upstairs White House office, not next to the president. What they do is put Trump, through the tweets and other methods, in a position where he will always agree and then retrospectively endorse what they're doing. And that includes war making inside the United States against the Democratic voting cities and war making outside the United States, like against Iran and Venezuela and so forth. So this is a unique set of problems. Scott's right. Second, it's very difficult for a Russian government or any other government, the British, the French, the Germans included, to monitor and understand what's going on, and therefore to be able to anticipate, and therefore, as Scott said, to coordinate with the US, both as adversaries and allies. And so the Russian capacity to understand what's going on and who makes the decisions and how the choices are being framed underneath Trump, that process was cut off by Biden administration, as Scott has just said. The total cut and disruption of Russian diplomatic channels and institutions in the United States, the legal closure of Seattle consulate, and so on. All of this has left Moscow more in the dark than usual. And that means that the intelligence services job, the SVR in particular, to understand and anticipate has been much more difficult. Therefore, what did we see? Well, we've seen, on the one hand, Russian public opinion supporting the president of the United States in an opportunity to make peace with Russia. That was a very significant shift in Russian public opinion. It was a very significant shift in Kremlin opinion before Trump was elected, but it lasted relatively short period of time. The Kremlin would like to extend it. So up comes the idea, and it's a good idea. It was a good idea. Let's finish with the Trump's bagman, Stephen Witkoff. We hear what he says, but does Trump hear what we say through Witkoff? Instead of that sort of intermediation, President Putin, the general staff, everybody, the foreign ministry, we all agreed, let's hear it directly from Trump. So they come up with a proposal, which Trump, for his purposes, finds attractive, to meet in Alaska. President Putin wanted to meet in a neutral place, in Dubai, but he agreed that it'll be Alaska. There are political and PR advantages in that, but it was the second choice. Then they go to Alaska and they have a foreshortened meeting. There was to be properly staffed 4 more hours worth of interactions. It was cut short. President Putin satisfied himself that he had explained to Trump everything and that Trump understood. Well, Trump has all sorts of difficulties. I don't know that we want to bore the audience with elaborating Trump's cognitive, neurological, medical, and emotional or psychological difficulties here. But on the Russian side, to interpret that, there's always a discount for personality, always a discount. No Russian educated to our age, and certainly President Putin's age, is ignorant of Leninist, Stalinist, Marxist analysis of the structure of decision-making in the world, okay? So it's not comfortable for Russians dealing with Trump to see the individual as either a loose cannon or an incredibly innovative individual. They see it, they must see it because it's true. Reality's Marxist, as Che once said. They must see the say, the structure of Trump's personality making decisions within an institutional framework formed by lobbies and factions and institutional interests and so forth and so on. Therefore, what Putin did was to say, let me talk to the guy directly and let's see what he understands. That's why there was, quotes, the understanding. What's the understanding? That there was understanding. But the question then becomes, when Trump goes home, enters the White House, what's the follow-up? And then you see the process of the retroactive presidency, the factions in Washington. And they're not Rubio, they're not Hegseth. They're individuals and forces underneath those individuals. Much more likely Radcliffe of the CIA, much more likely underneath in the National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, the people who control money, the people who control paper, they set Trump up. Now, Russian capacity to understand and anticipate that has been weakened for 10 years. But second, there's an incapacity on the Russian side, or let's call it a small fault, that the only Americans Russians listen to are pro-Russian Americans. There's nothing wrong with listening to your allies in a foreign state, but they're not a very good guide to what your adversaries in that foreign state are going to do to you. And that's a weakness. It's a weakness that's not admitted in Moscow. I'm not saying it's a fault to not listen to Americans. What I am saying is the problem that Scott said of anticipating what Trump will do is also a problem of anticipating who the people are and what they're going to do underneath. And then that's our job as analysts here, with whatever experiences, both military, political, economic, that we have, to figure out who in Washington's going to do what to which Russians when.
Yeah. Who, Scott? Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, look, again, John's, hitting the nail on the head. I'll just give my limited experience. First of all, I would be loath to call myself pro-Russian. I'm pro-American. I'm red, white, and blue, and I just happen to believe that it's best for America to have good relations with Russia, and it's better for America to try and understand Russia. And so I do that, and that often gets misconstrued as being pro-Russian or a criminal apologist or, Putin's puppet. So be it. My job is to try and better understand Russia, and I understand that I don't understand Russia, and so I keep trying to better understand Russia. And so I reach out every chance I get to talk to Russians, to get to know them. And so I've been invited to the Russian embassy on a number of occasions to go to the Victory Day celebration, Defender of the Fatherland celebration, Russia Day celebration. And I take the advantage to, talk to Russian ambassadors, to counselors, to defense attachés, et cetera. And what I've learned is that these are the people, and I know this because I used to, do a job in the Soviet Union that had an embassy connection. I know what embassies are supposed to do. I know what staff and embassies are supposed to do. Their job is to get out there and talk to people. If you're in the economic department, you're supposed to go out and talk to economists and businessmen and get a feel for the economic reality and, what the pulse is. If you're in the agriculture, you do the same thing. You're supposed to be out there gathering information. It's not espionage. It's standard diplomacy, talking to people, gathering information. Defense attachés, yes, they sometimes have a different tasking, and if you get caught doing that, they get kicked out of the country. But their biggest tasking is the cocktail circuit. Their job is just go get drunk with people, listen to them, and come back and write reports. The same thing with the State Department, different attachés for different things. You meet with people, you talk to people. And so the Russians should be out there attending think tank functions, attending academic functions, going to dinner with American colleagues, inviting American colleagues over to the embassy to have conversations, going to attend different seminars and stuff. And that is not happening at all. Zero. They're locked out. And so these are the people, again, the way this is supposed to work is, Scott Ritter, defense attaché, goes there, and I'm sipping beer with my my Russian friends or colleagues, can't call them friends, but, we're talking. And the Turkish attaché comes over, and we have an interesting conversation about integration of the S-400 into the Turkish Armed Services and what that means about the F-35. No secrets are passed on, just people talking, chewing the fat. And then I go back in my memory, and I type up a report. And I submit the report through channels. It's now a cable that goes into the system, and other people are doing the same thing. And then intermediate level managers start reading this stuff, and they read it. They may send some questions back, or they may then consolidate it, send it up. And you get all these reports that come in from the contact that's taking place, and it provides this body of data, this body of information that empowers decision making. It's a beautiful thing when it works. And yet it's being denied. The Russian embassy right now is an intellectual vacuum, not because the Russians lack capacity. They're not allowed to do any of this. I mean, they do have foreigners come in, but it's from the global south. But the job of the Russian embassy isn't to service Africa. And the embassy in Washington, D.C. isn't there to make Africa happy. It's not there to make West Asia happy. It's not there to make Southeast Asia happy. Their job is to learn about America and do things with Americans, and they're not being allowed to do this job whatsoever. I would have to imagine that a similar environment exists in Moscow for the American embassy. Total vacuum of information being gathered and no reporting going out of any significance. And so you ask the question, who? No one. There's nothing going on right now. The ambassador to the United Nations, when they talk about the potential of the first department to get involved in meaningful disarmament, it's just a total vacuum. There's nothing coming out of the United States. Nobody's talking. Nobody's doing anything. It's the same thing in Washington, D.C. There's no connectivity. I mean, we're dealing with the potential of Americans and Russians having inadvertent military on military contact. That's what a defense attaché is supposed to be doing, sort of locked in with his American counterparts going, hey, how do we prevent this thing from spinning out of control? What is it you guys need to know so that you're not worried about what we're doing? And we have some questions for you because we're concerned. And they exchange information and they write reports, and the reports goes up to the bosses, and then collegial phone calls can be made and problems are solved. No one's doing that right now, Nima. No one is doing that. It's an absolute vacuum. And I'll leave it with this. The problem is diplomatic muscles are like any muscles. I mean, an athlete goes to the gym and exercises and prepares for the game. And he may use a certain muscle group 1 or 2 times during the game, but it better function at that time because he has a job to do. Diplomacy is the same way, especially in a complicated field like arms control. If you're not exercising your arms control diplomatic muscles, they atrophy. The INF Treaty was negotiated by a guy named Paul Nitze. Paul Nitze came into adult significance at Hiroshima. He was there in the aftermath. He saw the atomic bomb. Paul Nitze is the one who took Kennan's long telegram and turned it into a national security directive that became the foundation of the Cold War, the containment strategy. Paul Nitze was there throughout the Cold War. He understood the problem, and therefore he understood how to get an answer. And the answer was the INF Treaty. He was the lead negotiator for the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. He's dead, and everybody on his staff is either dead or dying. When I was doing this thing back in 1987, 88, I was a kid in my 20s, one of the youngest people involved in this. Today, I'm 64. So the men that were in their 40s are dead. And we aren't training the next generation. So when, at some point in time, when Russia and the United States come back together, we normalize relations, we're not going to be able to start where we need to be started at this advanced state of preparation. We got people that the muscles have atrophied or they've never developed to begin with. We're going to have to retrain both systems how to work with one another, and that's going to take some time.
John, actually today, Vladimir Putin talked about the nuclear START treaty. He said that he doesn't know if the United States would be willing to extend that.
Well, no, that's not quite right. What we know is that on a particular, I'll come back to some of the important general points that Scott just made. The offer was made to extend the period of time in which the START treaty negotiations can take place. And some very important things have to be discussed. And Putin has made it clear that the Tomahawk as a battlefield missile is considered strategic on the US, is considered strategic by one side and tactical on another side. And there's a great deal of sorting out of missile capacity and warhead lethality that has to be taken between the two sides. But as Scott's just said, it needs time and preparation, and there's no implementation by Rubio's State Department of even the minimal agenda for improving diplomatic contacts, helping the plumbers fix the toilets in the U.S. Embassy, pardon me, in Moscow, and reopening the Russian dacha in Virginia and that sort of thing. Even at that level, the Trump administration and under Rubio at the State Department has not implemented a promise that was made. Now, so what Putin has said and Trump has agreed to in passing in a recent press conference in the Oval Office is that more time's needed. So instead of the START treaty expiring February 2026, both sides have agreed there'll be an extension of time for talking, serious talking, that means serious negotiation, until February 2027. And that's positive. But promising more time but not implementing what's required in the time is hopeless. Let me just go back to a couple of points that Scott made in general. First of all, we're both Americans. I've been a US citizen for 53 years. That means I've been an American since Scott was only about, 10 or 12. So the question of loyalty to the US side, analytical capacity to understand the dangers each side poses for each other, and a moral commitment to facilitating the two sides' end of conflict. And that goes back to it goes back to the Russian Revolution. So it's a century old. We're in a 100-year-old war that possibly is going to be a 200-year-old war. It's the responsibility of both the Russian side and the American side with goodwill to understand each other. Now, I've been a correspondent, a reporter in Moscow, married to a Russian with a Russian home for more than 30 years now. And I understand, with in-laws, I've had a granduncle who died in Leningrad and who's a member of the Immortal Regiment. I think I feel through my family, my wife's family, my wife's family's family, how Russians think. When I don't think I know, over the last 30 years, I look at opinion polls and I go out, just as Scott has said, and try to ask people. And that's the job of a reporter. It's the job of an analyst. It's the job of many parts of a government. When that's not working, you've got a serious problem of distortion of perception. In the vacuum that Scott's correctly described, what people do is they revert to their fundamental ideologies, their racism, their imperialism, their ambition to dominate. And that's compounded in the US-Russia relationship by something that appeared during the Gorbachev period and then became state policy under Yeltsin. That's the Russian faction that want to be loved by Americans. If you're an American like me, or you're American like Scott, you feel lots of people seeking to ingratiate for their reasons. Maybe they want a fellowship to Harvard University. Maybe they want to make a business deal. But being loved by the Americans has been a significant political force since since I think since mid Gorbachev, but certainly accelerated since Yeltsin came, and it hasn't disappeared yet. And that's a problem. That's a problem of misunderstanding on the Russian side of what their American friends intend, what their American adversaries intend, and you can see it played out in the misunderstandings and misrepresentations of the Russian propaganda machine and of the US propaganda machine. And that means, and has long meant, that the US press corps in Moscow, even when it was freest, always represented what it understood to be the official line. That's what the Moscow Times did. It was the mouthpiece of a particular line that was coming from, let's call it, the US establishment. And it still does, only now the Moscow Times is controlled by the Dutch Foreign Ministry. So there's an ideological problem between Russians and Americans. There's an underlying military problem that takes time to be solved, but as Scott said, there's no format for negotiating. And what there is instead is hate, racism, and the perception on one side, the US side, that Russians are a sort of white supremacist counterpart. This is part of the mega MAGA group that sees Russians as allies against the black world, the brown world, the yellow world. It's racism, and it doesn't solve any of the problems that we need to solve at the ideological level, military level, or the business level.
Can I just add something here? And I'd just like to get John's opinion on what I'm about to say. First of all, I agree. With the Russians, what I've seen is, again, I call them the Yeltsin holdovers, but the people in the 1990s who I say fell out of love with Russia and fell in love with the West and believed that Russia's path of success would be through the West. And many of them haven't lost that. They still in their heart believe that that's the case. And then there's other Russians that are more pragmatic, more realistic, that one would hope you could engage with. And it's actually very important to engage. As you said, there's no problem engaging with the Russians that love America. They want to engage, and they want to talk to you. They want to bend your ear. But the people that we need to engage with are the people that we're locking out. And the danger of that is that they are becoming less and less receptive to listening to us. And they, you talk about in America how we fall back on our base sins, so to speak, racism, imperialism, etc. I think in Russia, there's a danger of that too. There's Russian nationalism. There's nothing wrong with Russian nationalism. I think Russians should be very proud of who they are and what they are. But left in a vacuum, it could become something that is not does not help facilitate a better understanding between the Americans. This is why I spend a lot of time in Russia today. I go over there not because I know anything. I know nothing. I want to learn, but I also want to engage in conversations, not with the people who love America. Like I said, I don't need to travel to that. They'll come to you. But to go to Russia and find the people that they don't need to love America, but I want them to talk to America. I want to facilitate, communication so that, the intellectual muscles aren't atrophied, so that when the time comes for better relations, there's a body of people ready to engage in this. Because if we don't engage with the Russians, if we allow this umbilical cord of intellectual exchange to be severed, I'm afraid that the Russians are going to do what we do. They will collapse upon this body of extreme nationalists who will be looking out for what they believe is in the best interest of Russia, but may not be in the best interest of Russia as it regards to relations with America than the relations with the rest of the world. So, but it's tough to do this, because by doing this, you get accused of being, as I said, a Putin apologist, a Russian propagandist, whatever. But the fact is, I couldn't think of a more patriotic duty than what I'm trying to do right now, which is to keep this umbilical cord of intellectual discourse connected, because not because I'm going to solve the problems, but just so that the people who will be solving the problems have a foundation of connected people to fall on for assistance. Because no leader, no matter how strong, Vladimir Putin can't do this by himself, and Donald Trump can't do this by themselves. If they decided today that they want to have good relations, they're going to need a lot of help from below to make that happen, to turn theory into reality. And I just believe that those muscles, the intellectual muscles of U.S.-Russian discourse, need to be exercised as much as possible.
Yeah, I think Scott is basically talking about making a foundation to build something on it. Do you feel the same way, John?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure I understand your question, but the first thing I want to say is that I'm very glad that one Russian, my late wife Tatiana, loved me as an American. I learned a great deal from her life, and I'm very sorry she's gone. Loving Americans that way enriched my life. Second, both Scott and I have been troubled by FBI investigations of our links with Russia. Back in 1995, I was accused of being a Soviet spy. Scott has had also a very unpleasant targeting by the Biden administration with the FBI. In both our cases, the FBI has exonerated us. Links with Russia aren't criminal. However, as Scott says, in a vacuum of contest and conflict, in which there's always been a faction of, let's call them imperialist, extremist. The terms can change. You can call them neocons. You can call them one thing or another in Washington. The commitment to continuing the war against Russia generates a problem. On the Russian side, there's been, since the Yeltsin period, the formation of an oligarch business group, and they've loved America because they put their wealth, their children, their education, and their investment futures. They've invested in the United States and disinvested in Russia. That's one of the reasons that Mikhail Khodorkovsky went to prison, because he loved America too much. He disinvested and plotted against Russia and was convicted of some of those offenses. So you have a structure of business that isn't quite dead yet, but is being replaced. The Russian oligarchy, which loves America for a reason that has destroyed a vast amount of Russian capital that could and should have been invested in Russia. And to the extent that sanctions have forced a change in policy inside Russia towards the Russian oligarchy, something I've been reporting on and analyzing for more than 30 years now. That's one positive liberation that this war has caused internally to Russia. So we don't disagree, Scott and I. We've been punished in many ways for the line we've taken, which I think is, first of all, based on truthful analysis. When that's embarrassing, we've been, and it's run into hostility, we've been punished for it. Well, here you are, two old men talking. Well, Scott, not an old man, I'm an old man. Here we are, still talking in a relatively more positive future.
Let me just say, John, first of all, I'm sorry about your wife. I'm glad you had that relationship. And I'm married to a Georgian, but she's a Soviet Georgian, which means she was educated in Moscow. She speaks fluent Russian. And I understand exactly what you're saying. That's the kind of love that we should be committed to and cherish forever. So you're blessed to have had that experience.
Yeah. John, I think what I asked you, and you said I didn't understand your question. What was Scott? He was trying to say that if we want a better relationship between the United States and Russia, we have to build a foundation. For that, it doesn't matter how Donald Trump is trying to talk with Vladimir Putin. If there is no foundation, you cannot build a structure. And that's the whole point that Scott is talking about. Do you think that that could be the case in the mind of, is there any sort of concern, in your opinion, in the administration, in the current administration, or in the establishment of the United States to build such a foundation?
Well, look, it's an important and valuable question, and we don't really have time to go into all of the ins and outs. I could say that theoretically, the Russian side has looked at how to build that foundation in several different ways. During the 1970s and 1980s, it was a common doctrine, a common theory of policy that the Soviet and Russian policy should be as friendly as possible with the state of Israel, with the Zionist lobby in Washington, because for one reason or another, the Russians thought Jews are a highly influential minority group in the United States. And if you remain friendly with them, they will assist in mitigating the underlying hostility towards the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation. That's proved to be false, a false theory, a failure in politics, in strategy. What we have now is a much more complicated problem of Israel in Russian policymaking and Middle East policymaking and policymaking towards Russia's direct strategic allies like Iran. Now, Russia's correcting that mistake, or at least we hope so. Second, there's been the theory of business to business, that you could create the basis for the Trump administration to reduce the sanctions by not enforcing them, by finding co-investment deals and multi-billion-dollar resumption of business and investment and trade between Russia and the United States through oligarch connections, through industry to industry, business to business connections, and by hanging out large prospects of deals for Boeing, for ExxonMobil, and so forth. That theory has been implemented by President Putin's appointment of Kirill Dmitriev, a special emissary for foreign economic relations, who was educated in the United States and whose job has been to match the Trump appointee, Stephen Witkoff. Now, that's coming to failure. And it's very difficult for a line of policy in which so much has been invested to admit the failure. Dmitriev has failed to produce any of the significant policy, projects or businesses. And second, those businesses, for example, ExxonMobil, have proved to be unwilling or unable, more unwilling than unable, to lobby the Trump administration and Trump personally to find terms of agreement to end the war. So the building foundations, whether it was the Jewish lobby in Washington or the business lobby in Washington, those two approaches have failed. And there's plenty of consensus in Moscow, among my sources, Scott's contacts and so on, that accept the failure, but you don't have to say publicly, we can, but they can't, that this is a failure, because there's an ongoing effort to, as there must be, to rebuild pieces of foundation every time they fall off. So what foundation is left if you lose two of those building blocks? Answer: fear. There has to be a commitment on both sides to mutual assured destruction, to the understanding, and Scott's a military man, so he can talk more competently than me on this subject. There has to be an understanding on both sides that escalation control cannot mean dominance of one over the other, and there cannot be a system like President Trump's Golden Dome, call that the Musk Golden Dome if you like, that threatens to upset not only the mutual assured destruction doctrine that keeps us from firing nuclear weapons at each other, but at the same time, it emphasizes something that Trump said in his address to the U.S. Navy on its 250th anniversary, on a deckside speech on the USS Harry Truman the other day. It's worth, I haven't got it right in front of me, and I do remember it. Trump said, we lost the war in Vietnam because we didn't know how to win. We lost the war in Afghanistan because we didn't know how to win. It's political correctness that we will not tolerate anymore. We will win. I mean, this is a doctrine of MAGA in the United States against the cities of Chicago, Washington, Memphis, Tennessee, and so on, Portland, Oregon, and so on, Los Angeles. It's a doctrine of dominance around the world. And what's the foundation for Russia or any of the other US adversaries, China, India, and North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and so on? What's the foundation that can deter each side from doing something that upsets the balance? Well, fear is the way I call it. But if you have a president articulating win, win, win on the deck of a US aircraft carrier and assures everybody his policy was to obliterate, his word, obliterate Iran's so-called nuclear capacity, then you've got a president that's who's very difficult to convince that fear is a constructive basis for international relations.
Let me just add on to that. But fear is a constructive basis. So let's look at my assessment of Iran right now. Putin just had a conversation with Netanyahu. According to the press, and Netanyahu said, "Please tell the Iranians we don't want to go to war." I just met with the Iranian president 2 weeks ago, and he said Iran believes Israel's ready to go to war. America will back them, and it's a fight that they don't want, but they'll face. But the fact is, Israel is afraid because their Iron Dome didn't work. Their missile defense seal didn't work. They didn't decapitate the Iranians. The Iranians still stand, and any future war would probably bring a lot of pain to Israel that they can't afford right now. That's why I think the phone call was made. Now, Trump isn't going to admit fear, but Netanyahu wouldn't have made that phone call unless Trump cleared the way. So I think Trump inside personally acknowledges fear because Trump doesn't want a war with Iran right now either. And I think we get to, you talked about the different pillars of Russia that, the business side didn't work, the Jewish side didn't work. I think we're now to the military side and fear. And on New Start, I'm giving away a paper I'm writing right now, but that's okay. I'll promote it anyways. Trump talks about fast missiles. We got the super duper. I mean, he talked, the super duper, and it goes 17 times faster than anything else there. We do big, better. We build better, big, better, better, boom. Nothing we build works. Nothing we build works. The Sentinel missile, which is supposed to replace the Minuteman, which is 50 years old, doesn't work. They stopped it. They now have to extend the Minuteman. The Dark Eagle that everybody's saying is going to be deployed to Germany next year doesn't work. The Warhead now, they got it to fly, but they say we don't know how lethal it is because all we did is to get it to fly. We don't actually know what the kinetic effect on target is, and we don't know what its survivability is because, we spent so much time doing this contouring with exotic materials that we haven't we haven't tested the electronics. And what happens when this warhead comes flying into a Russian area protected by electronic warfare, jamming, etc., and they fry the electronics and the warhead goes stupid. And I can guarantee you right now, that when this warhead is subjected to the counter cyber testing, it will fail. So it means we don't have a Dark Eagle that's deployable right now. The air launch, the Super Duper, I think, is the AGM 189, supposed to be launched from B-52. It doesn't work. They canceled it, and then Trump said, bring it back. But you can't. I mean, it's like reviving a corpse. Trump ain't Jesus, and Lazarus ain't getting up from the dead. So here we have a situation where nothing we do works. Nothing. And Trump's coming fake. Golden Dome was supposed to be deployed by the end of this year, not the end of his term, this year. And yet they just let out a $150 billion contract that says, because they learned from the Sentinel contract, because Congress has a rule that if you spike above 18% growth in the contract, they shut it down for reconsideration. And every time Sentinel got going, it spiked. They had to shut it down. They're like, we have to close this whole thing down because it will never succeed. We can't afford it. So to get through that with Golden Dome, and I think John hit on something when he said it's Elon Musk project, but it's also Palantir's project and a couple other defense $150 billion for a contract where you don't have to produce anything. There's no deliverables. There's nothing. $15 billion a year thrown out so they can conceive ideas. And it's 10 years. So Golden Dome won't even be the first deliverable. It's not going to work. And so here comes the reality. Everything in Russia works. Oreshnik works. The Iskander S, which no one's talking about, the 1,000-mile version of the Iskander with pinpoint accuracy, that works. Putin said we're getting ready to declare new weapons. I believe there's a whole family of intermediate and strategic weapons that had been put on hold when the INF treaty was signed, when New START came in. Things like the Skoros, things like Courier, and others, a small ICBM and a smaller tactical fast striking missile. These are been pulled out, and they're being produced by a Russian defense industry that works, that functions, that delivers. And when Trump is appraised of this reality, I think you're going to see a sudden appreciation for arms control, because arms control is going to be the only thing that saves the United States, because we can't compete with the Russians. We don't have the ability. Trump can talk about the Super Duper all he wants, but it don't work. Trump can talk about Sentinel all fast missiles, slow missiles. We got the best missiles. None of them work. The only missiles we have are Tomahawks, which are very old, and they get shot down a lot. So I think that's my hope for arms control, is the incompetence of the American defense industry makes arms control a necessity when confronted with the absolute competence of the Russian defense industry.
I agree with Scott on the analytics of what works and what doesn't work, but it's our job. Scott's been a U.S. Army Marine Corps intelligence analyst whose job was to brief a commander. My job as a civilian in the Greek government and U.S. government is you've got to advise the boss on what, if it does work, how to prepare your options, what's your capacities in case something lethal comes at you, and it works. So we've agreed, I'm glad we're agreeing, that the both sides of allowing extra time, another year and a bit, 16 months away, to come to what Scott and I agree is a hope for arms control. But right now, some things the US does, Trump has done, work violently. And whether they worked when the US and Israel went to war against Iran, whether it worked, the violence inflicted on Iran is serious. And Iran and Russia and China have to come up with capacities to defend. The violence being inflicted on Venezuela, with which Russia has a strategic partnership agreement, by the way, pardon me, is working against President Maduro, is working against Venezuela and threatens to inflict a level of horrible violence on Venezuela. the level of violence the US inflicted in Vietnam, which didn't work, the war was lost, was horrendous for Vietnam. Okay, so the ditto Afghanistan. With the regional capacities of US war making can do a great deal of harm, even when the weapon systems don't work. And that's a problem Russia has to face on the Ukrainian battlefield. It's a problem the Russian side has to face in its relationships with Iran, with Venezuela, and so on. I don't mean to leave out the Far East, the China and Korea, and so on. But to come back to the Netanyahu telephone call, this is important. I'm glad Scott mentioned it. Why did President Putin initiate a call to Prime Minister Netanyahu last Monday? And what was achieved? From an Iranian point of view, and from an analyst's point of view like mine, nothing that Netanyahu tells Putin can be believed or trusted. If Netanyahu said, tell the Iranians X, the Iranians must understand, after all those months of listening to Stephen Witkoff, that nothing that's said can be believed. Number one. Number two, why did President Putin think that telephoning Prime Minister Netanyahu in the middle of the negotiations with Hamas to stop the genocide, why did he think the Arab states and Iran would regard that telephone call as in any way an assurance of anyone's goodwill towards them? Now, what's been the result? Well, the result of that telephone call is that the Arab states, when the setup was made by the Russian Foreign Ministry, Foreign Minister Lavrov, were ready to come to Moscow in a summit conference to follow the peace Gaza genocide negotiations that have just been overseen by Jared Kushner and Stephen Witkoff in Sharm el-Sheikh. What happened was that the foreign ministry's initiative to call a very significant Arab summit with Putin next week, October 15, has had to be called off. No significant Arab leader, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Egypt, was ready to say they will come. The only Arab leader, I believe, who said he was willing to come is the Syrian terrorist, al-Shara, al-Jalani, said he would come. That's unacceptable. Unacceptable to everybody. Certainly it should have been unacceptable to the Russian side, but an initiative that showed the capability of Russia to be trusted in the Middle East was fatally compromised by the telephone call with Netanyahu. And how that could have been imagined in the Kremlin to have had no negative effect on the Arab world, I can't understand.
Yeah, I think. Scott, do you have anything on that? Do you have your take? What's your take on that?
But I lack I have superficial understanding of what happened, and I lack the ability to dig as deep as John has. So I'm just not even going to try. John, I respect John. Every time John puts facts out there, the facts check out. So I think people should listen to what John just said and use that as a foundation upon. I can't add to it, and I'm certainly not going to try and counter it.
Yeah. I think we can wrap it up today. It was a great pleasure to have you both on, Scott Ritter and John Helmer. Great pleasure as always.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Nima.
Great time. See you.
All right. Good luck.
Good luck.